Hey guys, what's up? Public here, back with another video talking about Shadow Priest inside of Season 4. This is almost done with our series on Season 4 this week. If you haven't seen the other videos, we've already covered talents, booleans, and rotation. Today we are covering secondary stats as a Shadow Priest in Season 4. Let's dive in. Alright, so similar to other things, if you haven't seen, the Icy Veins guide is what I'm going to be kind of reading and kind of explaining in this video. If you haven't checked it out, highly suggest it. Now, I will kind of note that things might be in flux as the season launches, but this is just kind of where we're at now. I don't expect it to change too much, but just note things might be a little different if you're reading this on live. So first things first, as a Shadow Priest, your general stat priority has not really changed. You're still favoring intellect above everything else. And then for secondary stats, haste, then mastery, then crit, then versatility. Now, there is some slight optimization here depending on what talents you're running. In particular, Dark Ascension builds, you usually want haste and mastery to be kind of equal in that 5,000 to 6,000 range, and then you go for crit and then versatility roughly evenly after that. For Void Eruption, on the other hand, this patch in particular, we're kind of leaning more into haste as being preferred over mastery. Like, some builds will even run upwards of 7,500 haste as like their top priority, and then going from there they'll still run like 5,000 mastery and then whatever crit and verse is kind of left over in that rough order. But generally speaking, that's kind of what we're looking for. And keep in mind too, haste is particularly nice for covering up mistakes. So if you are kind of just starting out with the spec and something looks close in like your raid bot sims or whatever else, I would generally lean towards haste over other stats if it's close. Now, going into a bit more detail, the thing you want to keep in mind with our secondary stats is the kind of where we have to play around with diminishing returns. So in particular, our stats, once you hit 30% of a stat, they start to diminish in value, which means you're getting actual, as you go above that, you're getting less actual stats per point that you're adding. And they do this to kind of limit you stacking a stat too much. And generally speaking, these are like rough thresholds of where things start to fluctuate. For example, once you hit that first threshold of like 30% haste, you're now getting 10% less haste for everything that you're adding. So what that means is, if haste is not 10% better than the other stats, usually you'll start putting those points somewhere else. But again, all kind of depends on what that exact setup is. For a Shadow Priest in Season 4, we have a few goals to keep in mind for just kind of general builds that I would kind of suggest to start with. Now, of course, your personal sims are always going to be nice here, but this is hopefully, getting you a better understanding of why it's telling you what it's saying. So your goal here, first of all, is getting item level. Item level is still going to be a really good option. Generally speaking, you will not drop item level for preferred stats, particularly on pieces that have intellect. So there is an exception there with, even trinkets, rings, necks, that kind of thing. But for other items, you're usually going to prefer the higher item level stuff, even if the secondary stats aren't the most optimal thing in the world. There are some exceptions, but that's the kind of rule of thumb. After that, your kind of first goal is to get about 30 to 35% haste. This is going to be a good threshold for Void Form and Dark Ascension to kind of get things rolling. After that, you want to prioritize getting about 19 to 21% mastery. Usually builds these days in Season 4 are leaning closer to 19%, but in pure single target, particularly with Dark Ascension, you can go kind of upwards of 21% there. But again, kind of depends on what you're looking for. After that, builds are kind of getting roughly like a nice baseline of critical strike. 22 to 27% is that sweet spot, although a bit lower is okay in certain builds. Keep in mind that your secondary, your flask of choice will also influence this. If you choose to use the crit flask, you can run a bit less crit on your gear. These are final percentages taking that into account. If you're not running the crit flask, you opt for the versatility flask instead. You might need some more critical strike on your gear to make up for that. After that, you're going to have some excess stats just because of the way scaling works in Season 4. We're just getting a lot of item level. From that point on, you can continue stacking haste at that point. Like I said, Dark Ascension, you kind of want to cap out around 35%. Void Eruption, however, especially in AoE, can go upwards of 42% haste and still love that stat. After that, though, that's when you kind of start dumping stuff into versatility. And depending on the build, you could also go more into crit, but usually versatility is just kind of the last resort at that point. And that's kind of your rough goals for secondary stats as a Shadow Priest. The one other thing to keep in mind is how other things can affect what you're actually doing here. So some examples here, we'll start with haste. If you're using certain items, you might see your sims reflecting kind of a fluctuation in those goals that I was talking about. One of those examples is the Hood of Surging Time. So this is a great piece, particularly in Mythic Plus. It gives us a lot of haste every start of a pack. You're kind of getting like a mini Bloodlust or a mini Power Infusion to start off every single pack, which is awesome. It feels really fun to play with. It doesn't scale the best in like high keys just because the pulls are just lasting longer. But in lower keys especially, this thing kind of cranks. But because of this, you're getting so much raw haste that you can actually afford to run a bit less on your gear to take advantage of this proc at the start of a pull. So if you're using this helm, don't be surprised, especially if your sims in AoE are saying, oh yeah, you can actually drop like 2 to 3% haste or even more, just because you can kind of take into account this helm proc at the start of those pulls. A couple other things to keep in mind as well. You can kind of play around with your Ominous Chromatic Essence and moving whatever stat that is around. If you're using the Bronze Chromatic Essence effect here, your sims are going to be like, yeah, you don't need to get as much haste on your gear because you're getting it from Ominous Chromatic Essence. This will be true for any stat that you choose. You'll have to kind of compensate for that here. Other things to note are Spoils of Neltharis. You can sometimes roll this as haste. Your sims take that into account, so if you're using this trinket, you might see the thresholds be slightly lower on average. Other things are also Vessel of Searing Shadow, which is kind of just giving you quite a lot of uptime on a flat amount of haste. And similar to Ruby Whelp Shell if you're using it, although I don't strictly suggest using this. If you get the Under Red Wings proc, it is a haste proc of this, so you could notice haste being a bit wonky with that as well. Moving on to Mastery, we have similar effects to do the same thing, so still Ominous Chromatic Essence and Spoils, similar concept here. Other new ones that come into mind are Nymu's Unraveling Spindle. If you're using Nymu's in particular, you're getting a big burst of Mastery at the start of every 2-minute burst. So with this, you don't need to run as much Mastery because you're getting so much from the trinket at the high point of your cooldowns. You won't like drop all of it, but you could notice it go down a bit here. Pip's Emerald Friendship Badge is another good one here that could influence your Mastery output. And then another one to think about is the Emerald Coach's Whistle if you're using it. Again, just a trinket that can proc Mastery, so you might be able to run a bit less so you don't DR this as much. Another one that is not on here but will be by the time the guide gets actually published is Blue Silken Lining, which is an embellishment effect. If you happen to be running 1 or 2 of those, you might also notice your Mastery thresholds adjusting as far as like what you want on your gear because you can account for that proc. Just keep in mind whatever uptime settings you have set in your sim. For most people, on average, like progression content, 60 to 70% uptime should be pretty doable. Even upwards of that on farm will be easily attainable. So after that, there's of course some other things that can affect crit and versatility, but because we usually don't run that much crit and verse, we usually don't hit those DR thresholds. There's less to take into account there, so just keep that in mind. And guys, that's really it from a stat perspective. The one caveat that I want to call out is versatility. So I did push to title inside of Season 3, and part of the way that you can do that is by adding more versatility to make runs feel smoother and put less of a burden on your healer, and also help out with one-shot mechanics should they exist. I want to just let you know that if you need to run more versatility, you absolutely can. I did do a whole other video kind of talking about that in context of Season 3. It's still pretty relevant inside of Season 4, although some of the items I mentioned are a bit off. But for example, the most optimal Void Eruption setup in like an AoE environment only ran about 2,000 versatility in full BIS top item level. But when I swapped that sim to remove stats from Haste, Mastery, and Crit, and add them all into versatility to go up to 4,000 versatility, that was less than a 1% DPS loss to do that. And I doubled my versatility, which is a significant damage taken reduction on my character. So don't be afraid, even if your sim is like, yeah, hey, it's worse to add this verse here. If it means you're going to live something, it's a good option to use. And there are good sites like Not Even Close or others that can kind of help you determine that. Depending on the content that you're doing, you might want to swap or have a couple options with how much verse to add in your gear. But really, that's all you need to know for secondary stats as a Shadow Priest this season. Hopefully this was helpful. Big thanks to everyone that supports me on Patreon and my YouTube members. Hopefully this video was helpful for all you guys, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.